very special thank you to IESS for the invitation again. I have been here a number of occasions to Brazil. The hospitality is always wonderful, and I'm very grateful. This is a very complex problem, and it is not a problem that is unique to Brazil. Most countries in the world have experienced the identical problems Brazil has. South Africa has experienced the same problems. The advantage we have in South Africa is that we're a slightly more mature market, healthcare market, and South Africa has put into place some innovative measures to control the price of both medical devices and medicines, and we're going to cover them. For me, my task has been made very easy because Dr. Paulo set the scene for me. Bruno outlined very eloquently the situation. So for me, it's quite easy just to slot in and continue where they left off. So my agenda, I'm going to just a short problem statement, and I think the problems have been outlined very well by the previous speakers. I'm going to give you a definition of medical devices. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, but the range of medical devices is so great and so controversial. So let's see what the World Health Organization says about it. Some international trends in controlling costs and inflation of medical device. There is no best practice. There is no silver bullet. And I think Bruno mentioned it. There is no silver bullet. But some countries, particularly those countries that have a strong regulatory agency, have regulated the prices of medical devices. International trends in controlling the quality of medical devices, I'm going to just touch on that. You've got Anvisa here that is supposed to be doing that. International trends in regulating anti-competitive practices. We heard quite a lot from the previous speakers, what happens in hospitals. We saw the clip that Louise showed in terms of bribery that occurs, or consultation fees, or the evil incentives that are paid. What is most important, and the message I'd like you to take home from us, from my talk, is what did the insurance companies do in South Africa? Very similar to Brazil. South Africa, 50% of healthcare expenditure is spent in the private sector. We have a very large healthcare insurance industry, but it is a very well controlled, very well managed insurance industry. It's learnt a lot of lessons from the Americans. And then I'm going to just give you some recommendations, and these are South African recommendations. You've had some very good recommendations from the previous speakers. So the problem statement, and we've heard it, and let me go through this quickly. Medical inflation being much higher than CPI. Unfortunately, many developing countries are faced with currency fluctuations, and that does impact on the price of imported medical devices. As you all know, 50% of your medical devices are imported from the USA, Switzerland, and European countries. Most of the medical inflation comes from the increase in hospitalization. And the cost of hospitalization, one of the major costs, comes from medicines and medical devices. It appears that the tariff, the fee or the hospital tariff, has remained quite stable in Brazil, and the same thing has happened in South Africa. It's remained quite stable. The World Health Organization estimates that there's 1.5 million different medical devices. You can imagine trying to regulate that type of industry. So the major cause of price increase in medical devices, health equipment, and medicines is the lack of transparency in Brazil and very little competition. We did hear a lot about competition, but there seems to be very little. The local distributors and importers are poorly regulated with very little information, and I'm talking about Brazil, on company registration, on their financial reports, compliance and governance, and then, of course, quality reports from the distributors or the manufacturers. There is no transparency in the relationship between manufacturers, distributors, and hospitals. And that came out very strongly this morning. There is room to improve the enforcement of the antitrust regulation. The import system is very complex. We heard quite a lot this morning about the supply chain, the long supply chain. So that has become very, very complex. And my understanding is that it can add up anything up to 100% on an item here in Brazil. So here is the definition of medical devices. Medical devices means any instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, appliance, implant, in vitro reagent, or calibrator, software, material, or other similar or related articles intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings. So there is a distinction between medicines and medical devices. Medicines acts directly on the patient. It doesn't need an intermediary, whereas a medical device needs an intermediary. And that intermediary, as you've all heard this morning, is the physician. So international trends in controlling costs of inflation of medical devices. There is an attempt worldwide to standardize and regulate medical devices. Most countries are struggling to find ways to address the rising healthcare costs, which include pricing and quality control of medical devices. Regulatory framework is required to ensure that products entering the market are safe and efficient. My understanding is in Brazil, Anvisa does make sure that the product is safe. The question is that product efficient? Is it economically efficient? Is it clinically efficient? These countries look for best methods of classification, categorization, and reimbursement policy. So in Brazil, there is a classification methodology. There is a categorization methodology. It follows the world trend, class 1 to 3 or class 1 to 4. Brazil does have that system. What maybe Brazil doesn't have is a fair and equitable reimbursement policy for a medical device. Increasing greater utilization of diagnostic-related groups as a reimbursement system for inpatient episodes. So this is what has happened globally, and we've seen this in most developing countries and also in most first world countries, where they have changed the payment system for hospitals. They are introducing alternative reimbursement models, and the one model that we have suggested for Brazil is the DRG, a diagnostic-related group. This is a fixed fee, but it is a fixed fee based on the disease. It is calculated by actuaries. There's an algorithm behind it. So nobody is disadvantaged. The provider nor the patient is disadvantaged with the DRG system. The major disadvantage of DRG is you need the data. You need the data to analyze the payment methodology and the creation of a DRG. And that is quite a big and difficult task. So many countries do use international benchmark prices. South Africa, our regulatory authority, does compare prices throughout the world to make sure that there is no excess profit being made on both medicines and medical devices. So let's talk about United States. And United States has been proactive for the last 25 years in attempting to manage costs. We know that their healthcare expenditure is exceptionally high, 17% of GDP. But lately we've seen the Obamacare, the Act, come through. This is the Patient Protection Affordability Care Act. And the fundamental basis of this Act is that decisions begin with evidence. And this is sadly lacking in many countries, and we heard it this morning, that evidence is not really important in determining the use of medical devices and medicines. The need for scientific evidence in terms of the Affordability Act starts at practicing medicine. Medicine must be practiced according to evidence-based medicine. Any policies that are made must be based on scientific evidence. Efficiency, safety, and clinical outcomes, once again, must be based on evidence. And I'm telling you that because you'll see that further down in my discussion, when we look at other countries, first world countries, the way they've approached it identical to this. They've based their pricing and quality measurements on evidence. So, and the aim of the healthcare reform in the United States, and I think this should be probably throughout the world, all governments have a very similar philosophy, is obviously improving the health of the population. Not only improving the health of the population, but enhancing the experience of the patient when encountering a hospital or a service provider. Sadly, healthcare is a grudge purchase. People don't voluntarily go and buy healthcare. they land up in a situation which requires them to spend money that they don't really want to spend. And then, of course, reducing the cost of care for patients. So international trends in controlling medical devices, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just want to make you aware that the rest of the world is very aware that quality is imperative in the interest of the patient. So the Global Harmonization Task Force, and Brazil has some communication with this task force, is a group of representatives from regulatory authorities. And I think this is quite an important statement, is that, in fact, every country, the regulatory authority should be intimately involved in controlling devices. So the regulatory authority here is the USA, European Union, Japan, Australia, and Canada, and I don't see any developing countries here, which is quite sad. So the group has developed guidelines, and there's no reason why Brazil, South Africa, and other developing countries cannot follow these guidelines. So any medical device that is introduced into the market requires a pre-market evaluation. Once it is entered into the market and it is being used on patients, there obviously should be a post-market evaluation. And that exactly happens with medication, where there is a vigilance on medication. Quality systems and then auditing and clinical safety and performance of those medical devices should be an ongoing basis by the regulatory authority. So many countries have begun to adopt these guidelines, and there are a few guidelines. The United States, the Food and Drug Administration, which has a very advanced system and probably recommended for many countries. The European Union does have a regulatory authority. So I've identified two countries, France and South Africa, to talk about. And I've identified France not because they lost in the Rugby World Cup. I identified France because they seem to have done it very conscientiously and very thoughtfully in controlling the costs and the quality of their products. And there are similarities between the way the French have done it and the way the private healthcare insurance companies in South Africa have done it. And that's what attracted me to talk about the French. It is a complex process, so we're not going to talk about the complexities of the process. And you will see, when we talk about South Africa, you'll see there's a very similar process. So at the national level, at government level, there are three organizations responsible for health technologies assessment. We're not going to talk about the three, but we're going to look at the responsibilities and the duties and the functions of these three organizations. So health monitoring and control of all products for use in humans, obvious. For all safety decisions from the manufacturer to the marketing, including scientific evaluation, laboratory control, advertising control, inspection of the manufacturer or inspection of the industrial site, and then vigilance activities is performed as part of their duties. Assessment of drugs, medical devices, procedures, publication of guidelines, accreditation of healthcare organizations, and certification of doctors. So these organizations have a wide-ranging mandate to control healthcare quality and outcomes. And very important, provide scientific opinions concerning the usefulness, good use of medical devices and other drug healthcare products. So we see once again the terminology scientific, and exactly like in the United States with the Obamacare, evidence-based. So pricing process in France, we've already discussed DRGs. So DRGs have been introduced into the funding scheme in both the public and the private sector. Most medical devices are included in the DRG tariff, funded by healthcare insurance. And the devices not included in the DRG funding price are regulated by the government. So maybe let's take a pause here. And we know that DRGs is not the discussion, but you can imagine that if a medical device is included into the fixed price of hospital care for an episode, the hospital cannot change the price of that product. And the risk shifts from the insurance company to the hospitals. And there's a worldwide trend that there should be risk sharing between the insurance company and the hospital provider, and that's what DRG does. A very complex diagram, but what I wanted to draw your attention to is just the initial. Every product that is assessed by those three organizations must have a CE marking, a conformity European marking, which already establishes the quality. The manufacturer, if the manufacturer would like that product introduced into a public hospital and would like reimbursement for that product, they need to apply to these three organizations, and they need to provide two dossiers. The one dossier is a medical technical dossier, which explains the technical components of the product and the benefits of the product from a clinical point of view. The second dossier is an economic dossier, where the manufacturer or distributor must motivate why it is economically better for this product to be used as opposed to a competitor's product or another procedure or medication. It is analyzed by the three departments, and then at the end of it, a decision is made on whether that product will be paid for or not paid for by the public health insurance system in France. And I want you to bear that in mind, because South Africa followed a very similar route. The difference being is that in South Africa, the private health insurance companies took this responsibility. So the French pricing system, we talked about the medical technical dossier. I'm not going to go through all the things that it has and what it's required to contain. The economic dossier, let's just touch on a few things here. The price of the tariff required for the reimbursement. So in the economic dossier, the manufacturer or the distributor must declare upfront what price it wants for his medical device. It must estimate the sales forecast of that product once that product has reached market saturation, a justification on using that product as opposed to alternative products, what the cost of that product is in other European countries, very importantly, the breakdown of the manufacturing costs of that product. So suddenly we're seeing transparency. And the information about the company, where it is in France, the number of employees, the revenue of that company, and which other products are being sold by that company in France. So the system is totally transparent in France, bearing in mind that this is regulated by government. So international trends in regulating anti-competitive practices. We heard quite a lot today about bribery, about corruption. So I'm just going to give you a brief definition of antitrust principles. These are laws to protect trade and commerce from unlawful restraints, monopolies, or unfair business practice. Some of the principles, there are many principles of this, but some of the principles, it is illegal to monopolize, to have a monopoly. It is illegal to have a tie sales agreement. A tie sales agreement is where a manufacturer or a distributor forces a hospital to buy all its products from that company. Merging of competing healthcare businesses, two businesses that produce the same medical devices are not allowed to join forces. Agreeing to boycott an HMO. Manufacturers or distributors cannot agree to boycott an HMO. So let's look at some examples that were shown, particularly the clip, and this is a partial case study. So the US Department of Justice, let's call it the DOJ, requirements for financial payment to orthopedic surgeons. Let's have a look why this came about. There was a federal probe that revealed that manufacturers commonly used consulting contracts to induce orthopedic surgeons to choose their implants. So very similar to what's happening in Brazil. Sometimes there's a formal contract which encourages the doctor to use a medical device. So in September 2007, the 5 medical device companies that sell most of the hip knee implants in the United States averted criminal prosecution on certain conditions. They were going to be prosecuted for kickbacks. That's the terminology, the real terminology for consulting fees, for kickbacks, and they came to an agreement. So between 2007 and 2008, both the amounts of payments to surgeons for ongoing consulting activities, and the number of doctors receiving these payments was reduced. So the criteria that the Department of Justice established to stop this perverse incentive or evil incentive or consulting fee, whichever way you want to talk about it, is that every manufacturer and distributor would have an agent that would examine the books, the financial books, systematically evaluate the agreements between the doctors and the hospitals, the contracts, to see that these were legitimate contracts, because doctors do go to workshops, doctors do attend conferences, doctors do certain amount of work for manufacturers. So there may be a reason, a legitimate reason, for payment of a consultation fee to a doctor to ensure that the consulting physician publicly disclose their financial engagements to their patients. So it is the responsibility of the doctor to publish any monies that they receive from the distributor, the manufacturer, or the hospital, to publish it for their patients so their patients can see. And then the manufacturers must publicly disclose the name, location, and amount of money paid to each surgeon or organization on their websites. So there is now total transparency of what money is being transferred from distributor, manufacturer, hospital to doctor. So we spoke about it. Dr. Paolo just touched on it. The Sunshine Act. This is called the Physician Financial Transparency Report. So the Sunshine Act requires that manufacturers of drugs, medical devices, biologicals that participate in the federal healthcare program. So these are organizations that supply government organizations or are sponsored by government insurance companies, report certain payments and items of value given to physicians and teaching hospitals. So this is found on the government website, the CMS website. You can see the amount of consultation fees that were paid to doctors was $6.4 billion. The amount of payments in terms of records is $11.41 million. This is the amount of companies that are paying consultation fees, the amount of doctors receiving consultation fees, and those are the amount of institutions receiving consultation fees. And the very nice thing is that a patient can go here, put in the name of the doctor, click go, and it will immediately reveal exactly what consultation fees that doctor received. So once again, total transparency. But this, of course, is been inspired by government regulation. The reasons for transparency and disclosure on interaction between medical technology companies and physicians. Doctors are the prime users of technology and play the most important role in being the intermediary between the manufacturer and the distributor and the patient. Remember, we said that distinguishes between medicines. You need an intermediary to use a medical device. And this is because medical technical companies are legally required to provide doctors with appropriate instructions, education, training of services, technical support to ensure delivery of safe and effective medical technology and care of patients. So there is a relationship, and there must be a relationship between manufacturers and distributors, particularly with very complex medical devices. In all of these interactions, transparency is a crucial element ensuring that there are appropriate and beyond criticism in view of any conflict of interest. So obviously, if a doctor chooses a medical device because there is a kickback or there is a commission or because there is an incentive, that is a conflict of interest. So in South African experience in controlling cost and inflation of medical devices, so I'm addressing, I presume, a large portion of delegates here from the insurance industry. And this is the lesson that maybe you can take home what South Africa did. And the insurance companies did this because the government was slow in introducing any regulations. So regulation in South Africa, medical devices, including spinal implants, prosthetics, coronary stents, can be sold in South Africa without any checks for quality and safety. It has been the sole responsibility of healthcare providers to ensure that the plastic or metal products that they put into the bodies of patients are safe. Currently, the South African government is in the process of drafting regulations to monitor the quality of products used locally. We haven't heard anything about whether they're going to control price. South African government does control the price of medication, and it controls the price of medication very strictly, including the price of logistics in delivering medication from the manufacturer to the hospital or to the retailer. So surgical prices are unregulated and are a function of market forces. So in South Africa, manufacturers and distributors and hospitals negotiate price. The price between the hospital and the manufacturer is confidential, and prices are not subject to any regulation. So what has happened in the process is that previously hospitals were making excessive markup, excessive profits on medical devices. What the insurance companies and the hospitals agreed that this was not in the best interest of the industry and it was not in the best interest of patients. So at a forum, they agreed to transfer the profits from medical devices and medications onto the bed tariff. And the prices of medical devices and medications had no profits on. So this sounds a very nice win-win situation for everybody. The price that the hospital pays is the price that they charge the insurance companies. What did happen is that there was no incentive for the hospitals to negotiate price with the manufacturers because it was a pass-through price. And we found that the price of medical devices and medication went up because it was a pass-through and the insurance company agreed to pay whatever the hospital was paying. So in order to avoid this situation, the insurance companies and the hospitals agreed to change the fee-for-service model. They agreed that the fee-for-service model was perverse and there was no way of controlling inflation. And they introduced an alternative reimbursement model. And the model we introduced in South Africa is the diagnostic-related group that we spoke about, which is a fixed fee. So what happened now is that because the price of medical devices and medicines is fixed in the DRG, the hospitals now buy strategically from manufacturers and they negotiate price and quality. Insurance companies demand that the best quality products are used. So let's have a look what has happened in South Africa. So we can see that in 2009, medical inflation was 14.8%. The tariff here was 11.9%, so it does sound high. But remember, there was a compensation for medicines and medical devices. We can see here in 2010, the bed tariff went up 7.9%, and the CPI was around 6%. Of that portion, of the medical inflation portion of 12%, 4.1% was medical devices. So you can see slowly, medical inflation has come down with the introduction of DRGs and with hospitals buying negotiating better prices with manufacturers. So a strategy to combat the rising cost of new technologies by South African health insurance companies. There is sufficient evidence to show that new technologies are responsible for a large part of increase in healthcare expenditure. The question is, are all new technologies value for money? So how do insurers make decisions on which technology to reimburse? Bearing in mind that insurance companies have a mandate. The private insurance companies have to manage resources, manage the money that they receive from their members. And very often they need to pay or fund high-quality healthcare that is safe, clinically appropriate, and cost-effective. An attempt to achieve affordable premiums, to be sustainable long-term, and other financial protection for their members. So that is a mandate that every insurance company in the world has. So the decision about which medical devices and drugs to pay for are crucial to ensure quality and sustainability of healthcare. Clinical policies are one of the tools used to control the cost drivers and should be developed in a credible, transparent, and consistent manner using the principles of evidence-based medicine. So we see the theme reoccurring in terms of evidence-based medicines, and what they use is clinical units. So in South Africa, who is responsible for managing the cost of healthcare insurance companies, for the healthcare insurance companies? We saw that the government is not interested in South Africa, so the private insurance market took it upon themselves. Every big insurance company has something called, a clinical policy unit. The clinical policy unit ensures access to the best quality healthcare that is clinically appropriate and cost-effective. The unit consists of highly qualified health professionals, including medical doctors, pharmacists, nurses, and other professionals. The responsibility of the clinical policy unit is clinical research, policy development, and making funding recommendations to the healthcare insurance board, particularly with the development of benefits. The funding policies are developed in a credible, transparent, and consistent manner using the principles of evidence-based medicine. We've discussed that. So the process involves assessment of new technologies, and that does include pharmaceuticals, new devices and procedures. The request for health technology assessment may be submitted by external parties, such as providers or suppliers. So if a manufacturer or a distributor would like to introduce a new product into the market and would like to be paid for that product, they would submit a dossier, very similar to the French system, to the CPU of the health insurance company. Remember, in the French, medical technology, medico-technical. In South Africa, a clinical dossier and a financial dossier. How healthcare insurance companies makes clinical policy and funding decisions. If you remember the French diagram, medical, technical, and financial. In terms of financial, the objective of this filter, of this committee, is to ensure that the proposed health technology is correctly funded. The manufacturer or the distributor must provide the following information: the incidence and the prevalence of the condition for which the device is going to be used, historical and projected costs of the condition, and current treatment. How is that condition being treated up to now before the new device is being introduced? The cost of the new technology, the cost of other procedures compared to this technology or this device, the budget impact on the insurance company, and the cost effectiveness of this product. So look what's happened in South Africa over the last 5 years. You can see that the green line is CPI. This was the target that insurance companies set for surgicals, and in fact, this was the actual cost of surgical inflation in South Africa. So by using this technology, insurance companies using this technology, they managed to control the cost of surgical. The clinical policy unit receives a number of applications on a yearly basis for new products, and this is the breakdown. 32% new medication, 13% diagnostics, and as you can see, 55% of the applications they receive for reimbursement of new products comes from medical devices. So monitoring of quality surgical devices in South Africa, every medicine, surgical or consumable product is given a unique code. What is important is that the South African government didn't take the initiative to do this, so the insurance companies, together with the hospitals, together with the doctors, took the initiative to do this. And possibly this could be the first steps that could be introduced in Brazil by the insurance industry. So every medicine, surgical, consumable product is given a unique code called the National Pharmaceutical Product Index, or we call it NAPI. The NAPI codes are standard and adopted within the health insurance industry, and all insurance companies use the NAPI coding. And NAPI is governed by the NAPI Advisory Board. The NAPI Advisory Board is a private organization, not for profit, established by hospitals, insurance companies, and other healthcare providers, doctors and doctors' association. The NAPI codes are important indicators for payment and to identify the product. If a hospital submits an invoice without a NAPI code, the insurance company will not pay for that product, nor does the patient have to pay for that product. Health insurance have clinical policy units that ensure health technology assessment is completed on all new products entering the South African market. So you can see that in South Africa, the insurance companies took the initiative, were proactive in this process. Monitoring the quality of medical and surgical devices in South Africa. Once this is completed, the surgical risk management team from the insurer will negotiate on the pricing of the product. So once it's gone through the process of the CPU, the insurance company has a negotiating team that negotiates with the manufacturer on price. It is standard procedure for health insurance and hospital groups to form a health technology assessment so as to understand the clinical and cost effectiveness of new products. Quality is a big focus for health insurers, and they put pressure on hospitals to provide the best quality of products to patients. So very seldom do we see a situation where a bad quality product is used in South Africa. So I have a few recommendations. There were far better recommendations that came out of the meeting this morning. So from a government perspective, obviously a regulatory framework is required to ensure that the products entering the market are safe and efficient. I know that Envisa does the safety aspect of it. For quality control, adopt the Global Harmonization Task Force or follow the FDA regulations. Establish a transparency regulation, very similar to the Sunshine Act that has been promulgated in the United States. Strengthen the antitrust and anti-bribery laws, and implement an efficient, unique coding system. So that's what government's responsibility is. Health insurers, for control of inflation, introduce an alternative reimbursement model for hospital inpatients. Our suggestion is diagnostic-related grouping, and that was re-emphasized by the speakers this morning. And then establish a not-for-profit pharmacoeconomic unit to assess the quality and cost-effectiveness of medical devices and medicines based on the French model. Thank you very much.